Hi VPers, my name's Adam Huttenlocker and thanks for joining my talk. One of the most iconic features in the evolutionary transition from basal amniotes to mammals is heterodonty. These are size and shape differences across the tooth row, usually organized into separate incisor, canine, and post-canine tooth families. And images like this seen from the Middle Permian are a reminder of how paleobiologists and paleoartists really rely on the shapes and sizes of teeth to infer ancient interactions between synapsid predators and their prey. And fossils from this time period are critically important because the Permian was really the first time that large herbivores came to dominate communities in both richness and abundance, and thus formed the basis for more modern terrestrial ecology. So I've been very lucky to study different aspects of this terrestrial revolution, from the Permo-Triassic of southern Africa and Antarctica to the very beginning stages of the Permian throughout the western United States. And while I was a postdoc, I expanded my fieldwork into the Paradox Basin of southeast Utah, in and around what's become the Bears Ears National Monument. The geology of this part of Utah was a focus of extensive oil and mineral exploration from the turn of the 20th century to about the 1950s and 60s, but it was home to generations of indigenous cultures and now threatened endemic wildlife for thousands of years before that, and today it's the hub of a vibrant desert community and an important cultural center. From a paleontological view, the area's Paleozoic rocks have been a testing ground to investigate the late Paleozoic ice age's impacts on the early evolution of vertebrate life on land. And so the Cutler Group rocks that archive this fossil record are locally divided into the Carbo-Permian Halgaito Formation, the Permian Cedar Mountain Sandstone, which forms the mesas and pedestals of the area's many rock monuments, and thin beds of Organ Rock Shale that largely pinch out to the west and are mostly absent locally. So our group has focused mainly on the assemblages of the Halgaito Formation to better understand how their fossils correlate to established land vertebrate faunacrons in nearby New Mexico, how those faunas map to the global geologic timescale, and whether the assemblages of the Halgaito include rare or endemic species that bear on the early evolution of basal synapsids and other amniote groups. The fossil I'm going to talk about today comes from the Valley of the Gods along the southern monument boundaries. While vertebrate fossils were known in this vicinity at least going back to Case in the 1920s and 30s, the first systematic collections were made mainly by UCLA in the 1960s under the direction of Peter Vaughan, who regarded most of the Halgaito fossils as early Permian in age, based on taxa that I've shown here in pink. When the UCLA collections were disbanded, most of those fossils went to the Carnegie Museum, and Vaughan's students Stuart Sumida and Carnegie curator Dave Berman continued a lot of this work. By the 1990s, prospecting in the lower horizons produced a bone bed and some adjacent fossils sharing elements with the lower El Cobre Canyon's Pennsylvanian assemblage in New Mexico. And I've highlighted some of these important taxa in blue. And here we see a couple of my co-authors, Stuart Sumida and Amy Henrici, at the Birthday Bone Bed locality in 1991, just so you guys can see what that looks like. So in addition to showing this great preservation potential of older Carboniferous aged animals, the Halgaito in our study area has produced some new endemic taxa as well. The Osteolepiform Lawsonia was originally assigned to Ectosteorhynchus, which partly influenced Vaughan's assignment of a Permian age to that upper assemblage. He separated it later and named the new taxon in 1968. And in our first field trip since the pandemic, we collected this strange possible bolosaurid skull with these thecodont teeth that increase in size toward the back of the tooth row. If anyone knows what this is, we'd love to talk to you at the conference, so let us know. We've also reported a new Ariosolid with a forthcoming description by my co-authors, and the new Sphenacodont synapsid based on some isolated jaw remains, both of those from the Birthday Bone Bed. So before I show you the new specimen, I want to give a little bit of phylogenetic context. Sphenacodontids and the mammal-like therapsids diverged from a common ancestor nearly 300 million years ago, forming the clade Sphenacodontoidea, which probably originated as relatively small-bodied faunivores. During the Permian, both groups further specialized their dentitions to include Xiphidonti, coarse serrations for tearing flesh, and our best evidence suggests that this happened independently in both groups. Sphenacodontoids also include the first heterodont synapsids having mandibular canines, and this gives the dentition a high-velocity, high-stress bite that might compensate for otherwise low-power jaw functionality at this grade. However, it's unclear whether this represents another case of morphological convergence, or whether there was a single origin of mandibular canines in the common sphenacodontoid ancestor. So more fossils from this time interval really would help to better clarify functional evolution in the dentition. So in 2019, before the pandemic, we found a fairly complete dentary from the Vertebrate bone bed, more complete than the referred fragment we picked up in 2015. Based on proportions to other sphenacodontians, the estimated skull length would have been around 15 centimeters or so, making it a fairly small sphenacodontian. The lateral surface of the dentary is textured with numerous large neurovascular pits that connect to an internal canal, the inferior alveolar nerve canal, which spans most of the length of the dentary to about the level of these enlarged caniniform teeth before branching medially to form the incisive nerve canal. So this was imaged at USC's Molecular Imaging Center. And there's a unique lateral groove on the outside of the jaw that parallels this internal canal, a possible apomorphic feature also visible in the referred specimen. The teeth are subthecodont and slightly more deeply situated on the medial side than on the lateral side. As in sphenacodontids and some therapsids, the dentary does not taper anteriorly toward the symphysis and instead remains fairly deep. And the prominent caniniform teeth are situated on a raised bony buttress above the level of the more posterior cheek teeth. On the medial side, you can also see the Meckellian canal up here, and lower down, you have a nice long facet for where the splenial would have attached. Some detail on the morphology of the postcanine teeth. The teeth are medially compressed, but are only weakly carinated and thus without mesiodistal cutting edges or any serrations, suggesting that they probably were not important for shearing or tearing. So they were not xiphodont. They also lack the classic teardrop shape of sphenacodontids like Dimetrodon, and instead present as lightly compressed triangular cones with somewhat wide bases, reminiscent of the more haptodont grade synapsids like Paleoheteria, and especially like Ianthodon from the Carboniferous of Kansas. Another conspicuous feature is that the medially compressed crowns kind of expand and become more quadrangular at their bony attachment, and they're anchored by this sort of festooned plicidentine. And if you don't know what a festoon is, I've thrown one up here on the upper right. So this pattern was first described in 2002 by Kissel and Lehman in an unidentified amniote jaw from the terminal Carboniferous of Oklahoma. And based on more recent paleohistological work out of the University of Toronto, it's been shown as well in Dimetrodon limbatus and Sphenacodon, where the dentine is folded into this characteristic clover shape. So the new specimen shows some interesting mixtures of primitive and derived sphenacodontid features, and this leaves the question of how it relates to other better-known sphenacodontians. So we put it in a phylogenetic analysis updated from the Frobish et al. 2011 Cryptovenator matrix, and we found the Halgaito taxon in an unresolved polytomy near the divergence of Sphenacodontidae and Therapsida, so crownward of these haptodont grade taxa. And this was supported by the presence of the enlarged canine-like teeth, the raised position of the anterior dentary teeth above the level of the postcanines, the festooned or clover-shaped plicidentine, and the low crowns of the postcanine teeth showing proportions very similar to therapsids. Here's a time-calibrated phylogeny depicting the evolution of mandibular and dental features in Carbopermian synapsids, with the Halgaito taxon here at the star. And this illustrates that there was likely some unsampled diversity of heterodont sphenacodontoids in the late Carboniferous, leading up to the CP boundary, nearly 30 million years before the first therapsids. It's quite a long ghost lineage. For some CP sphenacodontid sites, we lack good age constraints that are independent of the vertebrate records, however. But there's some reasonably well-preserved sphenacodontine material from the Carboniferous Admire group in Riley County, Kansas. Some of this was first reported in a field guide in the 1980s, and more has come about since then. And this is the oldest sphenacodontine that's actually ratcheted to the global conodont biostratigraphy. So together, the Halgaito taxon and these isolated records from the mid-continent sort of help to fill important morphologic and spatiotemporal gaps between the basal haptodont grade sphenacodontians and therapsids about some 300 million years ago. Another avenue we felt was necessary to explore due to ambiguities in tooth homologies and subtleties in shape variation. We wanted to understand what variables drive tooth shape variation across the tooth row in basal synapsids, and how this shape variation changed from basal sphenacodontians to therapsids. So we teamed up with co-author Suresh Singh at University of Bristol and compiled a dataset of 65 available synapsid mandibles for 2D morphometrics spanning the Carboniferous through the basal Triassic. Semi-landmarks were digitized using Rolf's TPS series software, and we conducted a PCA analysis using the geomorph package in R. And we found that both basal pelycosaur-grade synapsids and therapsids generally occupied a pretty broad morphospace in which the first two PC axes explain 71% of the variation, corresponding mainly to tooth aspect ratio. So are the teeth tall and narrow or short and fat? And recurvature on that second axis. And more negative values for PC1 represented higher aspect ratio teeth. So this plot shows changes in PC1 along the tooth row, with pelycosaur-grade synapsids in green and therapsids in magenta. The therapsids generally having this higher crowned, high aspect ratio teeth toward the front, and then becoming blunter as you move towards the back, and pelycosaurs showing a bit more uniformity along the tooth row. Sphenacodontians display the greatest dental disparity of all pelycosaur-grade synapsids, and the Halgaito taxon corresponds more closely with therapsids, showing a similarly high variance across PC1, so a lot of variability in aspect ratio there. Clades showing more uniformity in their tooth shapes with low PC1 variants included some anomodont herbivores and some therocophalian insectivores. So given the notion that several therapsid groups show carnivorous specializations in dentition ancestrally, we wanted to know whether selection for increased shape variants along the tooth row was driven by the expansion of large herbivore prey and generally larger body sizes, especially since the Permian is again the first time we see amniotes in these large herbivore rolls, and particularly in high abundances. So here's a look at some of those data in time series. The horizontal bars are PC1 variants in synapsids by geologic stage, and the green and orange lines up top are mean herbivore and carnivore body size respectively. And what's interesting here is that PC1 variance either decreases or stays the same during the early Permian, and expansion of large predators and large herbivore clades like the diadectids, edaphosaurids, and casiids occurs during this time. This is the first time we see synapsid herbivores exceed carnivores in their size. Mean body sizes increase through to the putative Olson's extinction at the end of the Congorian, and then again up to the end Guadalupian extinction, where we get these really big herbivores once again. And tooth shape variation returns to levels we see in the Halgaito taxon. So the take home here is that the Halgaito taxon precedes these ecomorphospace expansions by several million years. So the initial drivers of heterodonty in these earlier sphenacodonts may be unrelated to the large predator-prey dynamics that we encounter later in the Permian. And without a truly ziphidont dentition, they might not have been doing any substantial flesh tearing at all in these earlier communities. So in present-day Utah, there were important shifts in abundance and evenness of aquatic and terrestrial taxa. And in the Permian-Oregon rock formation, outside of our study area, we start to see a lot more terrestrial elements and higher abundances of these large terrestrial diadectid herbivores, which are rare to absent down in the Halgaito. So it seems that as the Carboniferous drew to a close, seasonal fluvial environments like that of the Birthday Bone Bed provided an ideal mix of terrestrial and semi-aquatic prey that allowed small sphenacodont faunivores to experiment with varying their exposure to aquatic and terrestrial resources, eventually enabling their trophic ecologies to become more firmly planted in the terrestrial realm. So with that, we conclude that the Halgaito taxon represents a new sphenacodontoid from an interval in which the group is poorly known and was contemporary with the oldest known sphenacodontids from the mid-continent. The specimen shows that pronounced size-shape heterodonty with mandibular canines evolved by the common ancestor of sphenacodontids and therapsids some 300 million years ago. And it suggests that a high-velocity raptorial bite probably allowed small sphenacodont faunivores the ability to vary their exposure to small aquatic and terrestrial prey, and was later adapted in the Permian for flesh tearing of large-bodied prey with further modification of the tooth and the jaw structure. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening. I'd like to thank everyone who's been involved in this project in varying ways, as well as our support, and I look forward to seeing you all at the Q&A. Thanks again.